Because Chris Claremont, a longtime X-Men writer, hated having to write that story. You're probably all familiar with the Phoenix Saga, when Jean Grey was possessed by a flaming space bird that turned her into an almost goddess-like heroine. In the comics and the series, the Phoenix drove Jean mad and consumed an entire star system. Eventually, Jean was sentenced to death and decided to take her own life before the Phoenix could kill again. In the series, she was resurrected with the life forces of different members of the X-Men, but in the comics, her death was supposed to be permanent. Chris Claremont, who wrote the X-Men for 16 years, believed in long story arcs with real consequences, but I still wanted to give a happy ending to the Cyclops and write him out of history so that the new heroes could be introduced. So he created Madelyne Pryor, a woman very much like Jean Grey. Eventually, she and Scott got married, had their son Nathan, and moved to Alaska. But then the Marvel's editorial team, considering Gene Schuster's run, decided they wanted a new team with the original X-Men. Claremont had not only to bring Jean Grey back, but also to provide a reason for Cyclops to leave his wife. And it all becomes quite complicated. I'll elaborate on a few points from the comics as we progress, but in brief, Scott set up a team named X-Factor and Madelyne joined the X-Men, despite not having powers. It's eventually disclosed that Madelyne is a clone of Jean Grey, made by Mr. Sinister, just as we see in this episode. When the Phoenix sacrificed itself on the moon, a piece of it went into Madelyne, giving her some of Joan's memories and powers. In due course, Madelyne goes mad and strikes a deal with a demon, becoming the villain known as the Queen of the End. There was a big crossover event called Inferno, where two demons opened a portal over Manhattan and started turning the city into a living hell. At one point, Madelyne even tries to sacrifice her own son to keep the portal open. She's finally defeated and dies, and then of course returns in a later issue. After all, in comics, nobody dies. Personally, I've never been a big fan of the Madelyne saga because I think it cheapens death when comic book characters keep coming back to life. And X-Men writer Chris Claremont has the same position. But I have to be honest, on this show, I think they've adapted it really well. And that sets the stage for an even darker story to come later in the season.